A wealthy man challenges a homeless woman to design a dress, expecting her to fail. What begins as a casual bet turns into a journey of resilience, creativity, and redemption. As she pours her heart into her work, their worlds collide in ways neither could have anticipated, leading to a breathtaking revelation that leaves everyone in awe. The city square buzzed with energy, a living tapestry of movement and sound. Pedestrians weaved through the crowd, their conversations blending into a low hum, punctuated by the occasional bark of a street vendor hawking wares or the blare of a distant car horn. The morning sun glinted off the windows of surrounding buildings, casting sharp beams of light across the pavement. For most, it was an ordinary day. For Richard Ainsley, it was an inconvenience. Richard leaned against his luxury sedan, arms crossed, his patience thinning with each passing second. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his tie a subtle splash of burgundy that hinted at understated wealth. Every detail of his appearance screamed precision, from the polished tips of his leather shoes to the gold cufflinks glinting in the sunlight. Yet, his expression, an artful mix of disdain and irritation, belied his otherwise composed exterior. He checked his watch again. "Where is that idiot?" he muttered, referring to his perpetually tardy driver. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it, too annoyed to engage. Instead, his eyes scanned the square, searching for anything to distract him from his mounting frustration. That was when he noticed her. She was seated on a worn stone bench near the fountain, hunched over a piece of paper balanced on her knees. Her clothes were a patchwork of mismatched fabrics, a faded coat that hung loose over a sweater, frayed jeans, and sneakers so worn they barely clung to her feet. Her hair, an unkempt cascade of chestnut curls, was partially hidden beneath a knit cap. She looked utterly out of place, yet wholly absorbed in her work. Richard tilted his head, curiosity flickering beneath his annoyance. What was she doing? He squinted, stepping slightly to the side for a better view. Her hand moved quickly, pencil darting across the paper with a focus that seemed at odds with her disheveled appearance. The sketching, was it serious or just a distraction? For someone in her position, sketching felt almost laughably indulgent. His curiosity got the better of him. Straightening his tie, Richard strode across the square, his footsteps brisk and confident. As he approached, the woman didn't seem to notice. Her pencil kept moving, her brows furrowed in concentration. It was only when his shadow fell over her paper that she paused. Looking up, "Excuse me," Richard began, his tone clipped and vaguely condescending. "What exactly are you doing?" Her eyes met his, sharp, gray, and unflinching. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, slowly, she lowered her pencil. "Drawing," she said simply. Richard's lips twitched into a smirk. "Drawing," he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. He glanced at the scrap of paper in her lap. The lines were quick but deliberate, forming the rough outline of what appeared to be a dress. Interesting choice of pastime. The woman didn't respond immediately. She sat back slightly, her expression guarded. "It's not a pastime," she said finally. "Ah," Richard said, his smirk widening. "So, this is serious. You're what, an artist?" Her jaw tightened. "I used to be." Her words hung in the air. A challenge and a confession rolled into one. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Used to be? Let me guess. Life happened?" She didn't answer, but her eyes darkened. Richard took that as confirmation. "And now you're here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the square. "Drawing dresses in the middle of the city. Seems impractical." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't look away. If anything, her gaze sharpened. "Why does it matter to you?" Richard chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. "It doesn't. Not really. But I find it fascinating. Someone in your position trying to create something." He waved a hand, as if struggling to find the right word. "What's the point?" She didn't flinch, didn't bristle at his words. Instead, she picked up her pencil and resumed sketching. "Not everything has to have a point." That response caught him off guard. For a moment, Richard simply watched her, his smirk fading into something closer to contemplation. Then, as if on impulse. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "All right," he said, holding it out to her. "Prove it." She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Prove what?" "That not everything has to have a point," he said, his smirk returning. "Design something for me, a dress. Show me what you've got." The woman stared at the bill, then at him. Her expression was impossible to read. "Why? Why not?" Richard countered. "Think of it as a challenge, or a waste of time, whichever suits you." For a long moment, she said nothing. The square seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the money. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But don't think for a second you're doing me a favor." Richard chuckled. "Oh, believe me, I don't." She gathered her things, a battered backpack, the scrap of paper, and stood. As she turned to leave, Richard called after her, "What's your name?" She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Clara." "All right, Clara," he said, his smirk widening. "Don't disappoint me." As she disappeared into the crowd, Richard felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was going to be entertaining. He didn't believe for a second that she could deliver anything worthwhile, but it didn't matter. The game had been set in motion, and he was eager to see how it would play out. Clara's footsteps echoed faintly as she crossed the cobblestones, the weight of Richard's $100 bill burning in her pocket. She kept her eyes on the ground, her grip tightening on the strap of her worn backpack. The square behind her buzzed with life, but her mind was miles away, tangled in a mix of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. She paused at the edge of an alley, pulling out the crumpled bill and holding it between her fingers. The crispness of the paper felt out of place against her calloused skin. $100. To someone like Richard, it was probably pocket change, a meaningless amount he'd thrown her way for his own amusement. But to Clara, it was both a lifeline and a test, a chance to reclaim a piece of herself, though the stakes felt impossibly high. With a sigh, she tucked the bill back into her pocket and continued walking. Her destination wasn't far, a shelter she frequented on the rougher side of town. The building was old, its paint peeling, and the smell of damp concrete clung to its walls. But it was familiar, and for now, that was enough. Inside, the air buzzed with muted chatter. Clara slipped past the reception desk and headed for the small, shared workspace in the back. It wasn't much, just a few tables and chairs, a scattering of donated supplies. But it was a place where she could think, where she could create. And today, it was where she would begin. She pulled out her sketch, laying it flat on the table. The lines were rough, a first draft born of instinct rather than precision. But there was potential in it, a flicker of something that reminded her of who she used to be. Clara ran a finger over the edge of the paper, her mind drifting back to a time when design wasn't just a dream but her reality. The memory hit her like a wave. She was back in her old studio, a sunlit room filled with bolts of fabric and the rhythmic hum of a sewing machine. Her hands moved with practiced ease, cutting and stitching, bringing her visions to life. Back then, clients had lined up for her work, elegant gowns that graced runways and red carpets. She had been on the cusp of something great, but greatness was fragile, and hers had shattered in an instant. A fire in the building had consumed everything: her studio, her tools, her designs. Insurance complications had left her with nothing but ashes, and with no savings to fall back on, she'd spiraled. Months turned into years, and the once celebrated designer had become a ghost in the city, unnoticed and forgotten. Clara blinked, forcing herself back to the present. Dwelling on the past wouldn't help her now. She needed to focus, to channel whatever was left of her talent into this design. She pulled a pencil from her bag and began refining the sketch, each stroke bringing the dress closer to life. Hours passed unnoticed. The light in the room shifted as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Clara worked with a ferocity that surprised even herself, her mind buzzing with ideas. The dress would be simple yet striking, she decided, a blend of elegance and practicality. It would speak to resilience, to the beauty found in imperfection. It was a reflection of her, though she doubted Richard would see it that way. As she worked, a knock at the door startled her. Clara looked up to see Mara, one of the shelter's volunteers, standing in the doorway. Mara was a petite woman in her late 30s, her warm smile a constant source of comfort for the shelter's residents. Burning the midnight oil? Mara teased, stepping into the room. Clara managed a small smile. Something like that. Mara glanced at the sketch, her eyes widening. Wow, that's incredible. Are you making this for someone? Clara hesitated. Sort of. It's a project. Mara didn't press, sensing Clara's reluctance. Instead, she moved closer, admiring the details. You've got talent, she said softly. Real talent. Don't let anyone make you forget that. The words hit harder than Mara probably intended. Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Thanks. Mara patted her shoulder and left, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. The compliment lingered, bittersweet. It had been so long since anyone believed in her, since she'd believed in herself. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The sketch was done. Tomorrow, she would find the materials to bring it to life. The next morning, Clara set out with determination. The $100 Richard had given her was enough to buy the basics: thread, needles, and a few yards of fabric. But for this dress to mean something, it needed more than basics. It needed texture, depth, and a story. Clara scoured the city, visiting thrift stores and fabric shops, searching for anything that sparked inspiration. In a small, cluttered shop on the edge of town, she found it. A bolt of fabric hidden beneath a pile of discounted remnants. The fabric was soft and flowing, its deep, emerald green hue reminiscent of forest canopies after rain. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. She paid for it with trembling hands, the weight of the project settling over her. This dress wasn't just a design. It was a chance to prove something, to herself as much as to Richard. Failure wasn't an option. Back at the shelter, Clara spread the fabric across the table, running her fingers over its surface. She could already see the finished product in her mind. A dress that embodied strength and elegance, a testament to survival. She picked up her scissors and began cutting, each movement precise and deliberate. As the dress started to take shape, Clara felt something stir within her. It was a flicker of the person she used to be, the designer who had once dreamed of changing the world one stitch at a time. For the first time in years, she felt alive. But beneath that flicker of hope was a current of fear. What if it wasn't enough? What if Richard dismissed her work, laughed it off as a waste of his money? The thought was suffocating, but she pushed it aside. Doubt wouldn't help her now. With a steady hand, Clara continued working late into the night. The dress was far from finished, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was building something worth fighting for. The morning light streamed through the grimy windows of the shelter's workspace, casting long streaks of gold over the fabric strewn across Clara's table. She sat hunched over, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sketched furiously on a fresh sheet of paper. The dress had begun to take form in her mind, a concept that felt both personal and profound. Each line of the design was imbued with purpose, a reflection of her journey and the resilience it had demanded. Her pencil paused as she considered the bodice. It needed to convey strength without sacrificing grace, a balance she had often strived for in her previous work. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting her thoughts drift. Memories came flooding back. The precise cuts of fabric in her old studio, the smell of freshly steamed silk, the thrill of seeing her creations come to life on the runway. She exhaled sharply, snapping herself back to the present. Those days were gone, and there was no point dwelling on them. What mattered now was the here and now, the lines on the page and the story she wanted to tell. The design began to evolve under her hands, each stroke of the pencil deliberate. The dress would be simple yet commanding, its lines clean but unmistakably bold. She envisioned a fitted bodice that flared into a cascading skirt, the movement of the fabric mimicking the flow of water. It wasn't just a dress. It was a metaphor, a representation of transformation and perseverance. Clara reached for her notebook, flipping through its worn pages. The sketches within were a mixture of past and present, fragments of ideas she'd scribbled down over the years. Some were remnants of her time as a professional designer, polished, confident, and full of promise. Others were rough and hurried, born from nights spent huddled in corners of the city, drawing by streetlight to stave off despair. Among the pages, she found what she was looking for. A design she'd drawn years ago but had never had the chance to create. It was raw and unpolished, but the essence of it resonated with her current vision. Clara traced her finger over the lines, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She could refine it, build on it, and make it into something that mattered. By mid-afternoon, the sketch was complete. Clara leaned back in her chair, studying it with a critical eye. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was close enough. The dress was taking on a life of its own, its design rooted in her struggles, yet reaching beyond them. It was bold, unyielding, and unapologetically hers. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the night before. Reluctantly, she set the sketch aside and rummaged through her bag for the small loaf of bread she'd saved from the shelter's breakfast. She tore off a piece and chewed slowly, her thoughts drifting to Richard. What did he expect from her? Did he think she'd fail, that she'd come crawling back to him with a half-finished dress and an apology for wasting his time? The thought made her jaw tighten. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Clara finished her bread and stood, stretching the stiffness from her back. It was time to start sewing. She gathered her materials, the emerald green fabric she'd found the day before, a spool of thread, and the borrowed needle she'd managed to scrounge from the shelter's limited supplies. Each piece felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming her identity. As the hours ticked by, the dress began to take shape. Clara's fingers moved deftly, stitching with a precision born of years of practice. She worked methodically, her focus unbroken despite the ache in her shoulders and the growing fatigue in her hands. The fabric was stubborn at times, its edges fraying and refusing to cooperate, but Clara persisted. Each stitch was an act of defiance, a refusal to let her circumstances define her. By evening, the bodice was nearly complete. Clara held it up to the light, inspecting the seams. It wasn't perfect. There were tiny flaws that only she would notice, but it was hers. The fabric caught the light in a way that made it seem almost alive, its rich green hue shifting like leaves in a forest breeze. A knock at the door startled her, and she turned to see Mara peeking in. "Still at it?" Mara asked, stepping into the room. Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm getting there." Mara's eyes fell on the dress, and her breath caught. "Clara, that's beautiful." Clara felt a flush of pride, but quickly masked it. "It's not done yet." "Even so," Mara said, moving closer to admire the details. "You've got something special here. I hope he appreciates it." "He won't," Clara said without hesitation. "But it doesn't matter. This isn't for him." Mara tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Then who is it for?" Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing against the fabric. "Me," she said quietly. "It's for me." After Mara left, Clara worked late into the night, her hands moving with renewed determination. She added layers to the skirt, each one carefully pleated to create a sense of movement. She reinforced the seams, making sure the dress could withstand scrutiny. With each step, her confidence grew, the doubts that had plagued her for years slowly dissolving. But as she neared the finish line, a new worry crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if Richard dismissed her work with the same condescension he'd shown in the square? The thought was a knife to her gut, but Clara pushed it aside. She couldn't control his reaction, only her effort. And she would give this dress everything she had. By dawn, the dress was nearly complete. Clara stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans as she studied her work. The dress stood on a makeshift mannequin, a wire frame draped in padding that barely held its shape. But even in its imperfect setting, the dress shone. It was a piece of her, stitched together with hope, determination, and defiance. Clara sank into her chair, exhaustion washing over her. There was still work to be done. Minor adjustments, final touches, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of pride. The dress was more than just fabric and thread. It was a testament to her resilience, a reminder that she was still capable of creating beauty in a world that had tried to strip it away. Tomorrow, she would face Richard. And no matter what he said, Clara knew one thing for certain. She had already won. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the city streets as Clara made her way toward the small workspace she'd claimed in the shelter. The dress was nearing completion, but the weight of her task pressed heavily on her shoulders. Each step she took felt both purposeful and precarious, as though she were walking a tightrope between hope and uncertainty. Inside the workspace, the dress awaited her. It stood on the makeshift mannequin, the emerald green fabric glowing faintly in the dim light. Clara approached it slowly, her eyes scanning every seam and fold. It was almost there, but the final touches would determine whether it truly came alive. Clara set down her bag and began working, her hands moving with practiced precision. She adjusted the hem, added delicate stitching to the bodice, and carefully layered the skirt to enhance its movement. Each thread felt like a strand of her own story being woven into the fabric. This dress wasn't just a creation. It was a reflection of her resilience, her defiance, her refusal to fade into the background. As the hours passed, Clara's focus sharpened. The sounds of the shelter, muffled conversations, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the building's ancient heating system faded into the background. Her world narrowed to the fabric beneath her fingers and the vision in her mind. She lost herself in the work, the repetitive motions grounding her in a way that felt almost meditative. But beneath her calm exterior, a storm brewed. Doubts swirled in the corners of her mind, whispering insidious questions. What if the dress wasn't good enough? What if Richard dismissed her work without a second glance? What if all her effort was for nothing? Clara paused, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at the nearly finished dress. She hated how much his opinion mattered, how deeply his dismissive words had burrowed into her psyche. She wanted to believe that this dress was for herself, that it didn't matter what he thought. But the truth was messier than that. It did matter. His validation, or lack of it, would feel like a verdict on her worth. She shook her head, banishing the thoughts. Focus, she muttered to herself, picking up her needle again. Just finish. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard sat in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success. The space was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, with a view that overlooked the bustling heart of the city. But Richard wasn't looking at the view. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, as he recounted the events of the previous day to his colleagues. "So, let me get this straight," one of them said, leaning forward with a smirk. "You gave a homeless woman $100 and told her to design a dress?" Richard shrugged, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "Why not? She was sitting there sketching like she thought she was Picasso or something. I figured, let's see what she's got. And you think she'll actually do it?" Another colleague asked, laughing. Richard swirled the whiskey in his glass, his grin widening. "Honestly, I doubt it. But who knows? Maybe she'll surprise me. Either way, it's entertainment." The group laughed, their amusement tinged with disbelief. But as the conversation shifted to other topics, Richard found his thoughts lingering on Clara. There had been something in her eyes when she took the money, a spark of defiance that had unsettled him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it made him wonder if he'd underestimated her. Back at the shelter, Clara worked late into the night. The dress was finally coming together, its lines flowing seamlessly from one element to the next. She stepped back, studying it with a critical eye. It was bold and elegant, its simplicity hiding a complexity that only a trained eye would notice. Clara allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and it was enough. The next morning, Clara gathered her things and prepared to leave the shelter. The dress was carefully packed in a garment bag, its weight a reassuring presence in her hands. As she stepped outside, the crisp morning air bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on the task ahead. The journey to Richard's office felt surreal. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm. Cars honking, pedestrians rushing, vendors calling out their wares. But Clara felt detached from it all. She was walking into the unknown, carrying not just a dress but a piece of herself. When Clara arrived at the towering glass building that housed Richard's office, she hesitated at the entrance. The polished marble floors and sleek modern design were a stark contrast to the world she'd come from. She adjusted her grip on the garment bag, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. This was it. Inside, the receptionist gave her a skeptical once-over, but directed her to the elevator. The ride up felt interminable, each floor a reminder of how far she was from the life she once knew. When the doors finally opened, Clara stepped out into a plush corridor lined with abstract art and soft lighting. Richard's assistant greeted her with a raised eyebrow. "You're here to see Mr. Ainsley?" Clara nodded, her grip tightening on the bag. "Yes, I have the dress." The assistant hesitated, then motioned for her to follow. They walked to a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Richard was already there, leaning casually against the table, his expression unreadable. "Clara," he said, his tone light but edged with curiosity. "You actually showed up." Clara didn't respond. She set the garment bag on the table and carefully unzipped it, revealing the dress. For a moment, the room was silent. Richard's smirk faltered as his eyes fell on the garment. His colleagues, who had gathered out of curiosity, exchanged looks of surprise. Clara stepped back, her heart pounding. She didn't need their words to know the dress had made an impact. The way they stared at it, their expressions shifting from amusement to awe, was enough. Richard finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Well, I'll be damned." The conference room was a stark contrast to the world Clara had left behind. Its sleek, modern design, clean lines, polished surfaces, and the hum of quiet luxury felt almost sterile. The sprawling view of the city stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a reminder of just how high she was, both literally and metaphorically, from the life she lived below. Richard Ainsley stood at the head of the room, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His posture was relaxed, but his sharp green eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. Around him, a small group of colleagues and assistants murmured in low voices, their skepticism palpable. The dress was still concealed within its garment bag, lying across the table like a secret waiting to be revealed. Clara's fingers trembled as she adjusted the bag zipper. She wasn't nervous, she told herself. She was prepared. She had spent days pouring every ounce of her skill and emotion into this dress. And yet, as she stood there under their scrutinizing gazes, doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve. "Well," Richard said, breaking the silence. His voice was light, almost amused. "Let's see it." Clara inhaled deeply, steadying her hands. With deliberate movements, she unzipped the garment bag and drew it open, revealing the emerald green dress in all its glory. The room fell silent. The fabric caught the light, shimmering faintly as it cascaded in soft, elegant folds. The fitted bodice was accentuated with subtle stitching that mimicked the veins of a leaf, while the skirt flared out like a waterfall frozen in time. It was both simple and intricate, its beauty understated yet impossible to ignore. Every detail spoke of care and intention, as though the dress itself had a story to tell. For a moment, no one moved. Richard's colleagues, who had been whispering moments earlier, now stared at the dress in stunned silence. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an impeccable sense of style, leaned forward, her expression shifting from skepticism to admiration. "Is this your design?" she asked, her tone incredulous. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The woman stepped closer, inspecting the dress with a critical eye. "It's remarkable," she said softly. "The structure, the texture, it's like nothing I've seen before." Richard, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Remarkable?" he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "Come on, Amelia, it's just a dress." Amelia turned to him, her gaze sharp. "It's not just a dress, Richard. Look at the craftsmanship. This isn't something you whip up overnight. This takes skill, vision." Clara's chest tightened. The unexpected praise was like a lifeline, but Richard's dismissive tone felt like a weight dragging her down. She forced herself to speak, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "It's more than a dress," she said, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "It's a story of resilience, of finding beauty in the broken pieces." Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly. "Beauty in broken pieces," he repeated, as though testing the phrase. He stepped closer to the dress, studying it for the first time without the veil of amusement. His fingers brushed against the fabric, his expression unreadable. "So, this is your masterpiece," he said finally, his tone quieter. "This is what you came up with." Clara straightened, her chin lifting.
"Yes."
He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the dress. "You know," he said after a moment, "I didn't expect you to actually deliver. I thought you'd take the money and disappear." "Of course you did," Clara said, her words sharper than she intended. "Because people like me aren't supposed to be capable of something like this. Isn't that right?" Richard looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to," she replied. "It was obvious from the moment we met." The room grew tense, the air thick with unspoken words. Richard's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to navigate the charged atmosphere. Amelia, however, stepped forward, her focus entirely on Clara. "This dress deserves to be seen," Amelia said firmly. "Have you considered showcasing it? There's a gala next month, a fundraiser for local artists. Pieces like this would draw serious attention." Clara blinked, caught off guard. I hadn't thought about it." "Well, you should," Amelia said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Richard. "You've got connections in the industry. If you're serious about helping her—" "I never said I was serious," Richard interrupted, his tone defensive. "This was a bet, an experiment." "Maybe it's time you rethink your experiment," Amelia shot back. "Because whether you intended to or not, you've stumbled onto something extraordinary." Richard frowned, his gaze shifting between Clara and the dress. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, his usual confidence wavering. Clara watched him closely, her own emotions a whirlwind of pride, frustration, and exhaustion. She had come here expecting ridicule, but instead, she'd found herself at the center of a conversation she hadn't anticipated. As the discussion continued, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The dress had spoken for itself, its beauty undeniable even to those who had doubted her. For the first time, she began to believe that her journey might not end here, in this room, under Richard's gaze. Perhaps this was only the beginning. Richard's voice broke through her thoughts. "All right," he said, his tone resigned. "Let's say this dress is as impressive as you all seem to think. What's your plan, Clara? What do you want from this?" Clara hesitated, the weight of the question settling over her. What did she want? Recognition? Redemption? Or simply the chance to prove that she was still capable of creating something meaningful? "I want a chance," she said finally, her voice steady. "A chance to show the world what I can do." Richard studied her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Then, with a faint smirk, he nodded. "All right, Clara, you'll get your chance." The days following her presentation to Richard passed in a blur for Clara. After the tension in the conference room, she had expected nothing more than polite dismissal, or worse, outright rejection. But instead, a door had cracked open. Amelia's suggestion to showcase the dress at a gala fundraiser for local artists had set something in motion, and now Clara found herself caught in the undertow. It began with a phone call. The shelter's shared phone rarely rang for her, so when Mara called out Clara's name with a curious lilt, she almost didn't respond. Hesitantly, Clara picked up the receiver. "Miss Clara, this is Eleanor Baines from the City Art Foundation," a warm, authoritative voice said. "I was shown your work, your dress, and I must say, it's exquisite. We'd like to feature it in our upcoming gala." Clara gripped the phone tighter, her heart racing. "You've seen it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her tone firm but encouraging. "Richard Ainsley himself forwarded photos. He spoke highly of your talent." Clara blinked in disbelief. Richard had done that? It seemed out of character for the man who had approached her with mocking condescension. And yet, here was the proof. "Are you interested?" Eleanor asked, her voice breaking through Clara's thoughts. "Yes," Clara said quickly, then cleared her throat. "Yes, I'm interested. Thank you." "Wonderful," Eleanor said, and the conversation turned to details. As Clara hung up the phone, Her hand trembled. She stared at it for a moment, her mind reeling. This was real. The gala was happening, and her dress was going to be part of it. The days leading up to the event were a whirlwind of activity. Clara returned to her dress with fresh eyes, making final adjustments to ensure every detail was perfect. The shelter's workspace became her sanctuary, a place where she could pour all her nervous energy into her craft. Mara checked in often, offering quiet encouragement. "You're going to steal the show," Mara said one evening as Clara carefully added a final row of stitching to the hem. Clara smiled faintly. "I just want to hold my own," she replied. "These people, they're in a different world." Mara placed a hand on her shoulder. "You belong there as much as anyone. Don't forget that." Clara nodded, but doubt lingered at the edges of her mind. She had spent so long on the margins, invisible to the world she once aspired to be part of. Could she really step back into that world and be seen? The night of the gala arrived faster than Clara anticipated. She stood outside the grand venue, the towering marble columns and glittering chandeliers visible through the expansive glass facade. Her nerves threatened to overwhelm her as she clutched the garment bag containing her dress. Beside her stood Eleanor, a poised woman in her 60s who exuded effortless confidence. "You'll do fine," Eleanor said with a reassuring smile as they entered the venue. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation. Guests in elegant attire sipped champagne and admired the various works of art on display. Clara felt out of place in her modest dress and worn shoes, but she forced herself to focus. This was about the dress, not her. The moment arrived quickly. Eleanor guided her to a small stage where the featured pieces were being presented. Clara's dress was unveiled under a spotlight, and a hush fell over the room. For a moment, Clara forgot to breathe. The dress shimmered in the light, its emerald hues deep and vibrant. The folds of the skirt moved like waves as the mannequin turned slowly on its platform. The audience stared, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Clara stood to the side, her heart pounding as she watched the reactions. A woman in a flowing black gown approached her, her eyes alight with excitement. "Are you the designer?" she asked. Clara nodded hesitantly. "Yes." The woman beamed. "It's stunning. The detail, the movement, it's unlike anything I've seen. Do you have other work?" Clara hesitated. "Not yet." "Well, you should," the woman said firmly. "You've got a gift." More guests approached, each one praising the dress and asking questions. Clara answered as best she could, her confidence growing with each interaction. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a homeless woman or a charity case, but as an artist. In the crowd, Richard watched from a distance. He leaned casually against the bar, a glass of champagne in his hand, his expression unreadable. Amelia stood beside him, her sharp gaze fixed on Clara. "You didn't think she'd pull it off, did you?" Amelia said, her tone more amused than accusatory. Richard sipped his drink. "I didn't think about it that much," he admitted. "Liar," Amelia said with a smirk. "You're here, aren't you?" Richard didn't respond. Instead, he watched as Clara spoke with another guest, her posture more relaxed now, her smile genuine. There was something about her presence, quiet but commanding, that unsettled him. She had taken his challenge and turned it into something remarkable, something that transcended the boundaries he had placed around her. He set his glass down and approached the stage. Clara saw him coming and straightened, her smile fading slightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You did it," Richard said finally, his tone neutral. "I told you I would," Clara replied, her voice steady. Richard nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You were right," he said. "It's not just a dress. It's something more." Clara searched his face, unsure of how to respond. The sincerity in his voice was unexpected, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of vulnerability behind his confident facade. "Thank you," she said simply. Richard gave a faint smile and stepped back, allowing her to return to the crowd. As he watched her interact with the guests, a thought nagged at him. Clara wasn't just talented, she was extraordinary. And for the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated not just her, but the potential of people he had dismissed his entire life. The applause still echoed faintly in Clara's ears as she slipped through the side door of the gala, stepping into the cool night air. The stars above the city twinkled faintly, their light drowned out by the glow of street lamps and the bustling life below. She clutched the dress, now carefully packed back into its garment bag, as though it were a lifeline. The night had been a whirlwind, and though she had smiled and spoken with confidence, her mind swirled with thoughts she couldn't yet untangle. From the moment the dress had been unveiled, Clara had been met with an outpouring of admiration. Artists, critics, and patrons alike had approached her with praise, their words a balm to the wounds of her past. But beneath the surface of her pride lay a quiet unease. She had stepped into this world once before, only to be swallowed by its demands and discarded when she fell. Would it be any different this time? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Richard walking toward her, his hands tucked into his pockets. His usually confident stride was slower, almost hesitant, and his expression was uncharacteristically serious. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. Clara shrugged, her grip tightening on the garment bag. "I've had enough for one night." Richard nodded, coming to a stop a few feet away. "I get that," he said. "Big crowds can be overwhelming." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't seem like someone who gets overwhelmed." He chuckled lightly, the sound tinged with self-awareness. "You'd be surprised." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city's distant hum filled the silence between them, a reminder of the world continuing on despite the weight of their conversation. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "You did something incredible tonight," he said, his gaze steady. "That dress. It's more than I ever expected." Clara studied him, searching for the catch in his words, the sarcasm or dismissal she had come to associate with him. But there was none. Instead, his expression was thoughtful, almost introspective. "Why did you even challenge me in the first place?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "Was it just a game to you?" Richard looked away, his jaw tightening. "At first, maybe," he admitted. I don't know, that it'd be funny. That you'd fail." Clara's chest tightened at his words, but she held her ground, her eyes fixed on his. "But you didn't fail," Richard continued, his voice softening. "You proved me wrong. And not just about the dress." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, her voice wary. Richard hesitated, the vulnerability in his expression deepening. "I've spent most of my life thinking I had people figured out," he said, "that I could size them up in an instant and know exactly who they were, what they were capable of. But you challenged that. You made me realize how narrow my perspective has been." Clara blinked, caught off guard by his candor. The man standing before her felt worlds apart from the one she had met in the square, his mocking grin replaced by a quiet sincerity that unsettled her. "I don't know what to say to that," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Richard said quickly. I wanted you to know." They stood in silence again, the tension between them easing slightly. Clara glanced down at the garment bag in her hands, the weight of it grounding her. The dress had been a labor of love, a piece of herself stitched together from fragments of her past. But as she looked at Richard, she realized it had also become something more, a bridge between their vastly different worlds. "Why did you send the photos to Eleanor?" she asked after a moment. "You didn't have to do that." Richard smiled faintly. "I guess I wanted to see what you'd do with the opportunity. And maybe I wanted to make up for how I treated you." "Not that it excuses anything." Clara nodded slowly, her emotions a jumble of gratitude and lingering resentment. She appreciated his honesty, but the scars of their initial encounter still ached. Forgiveness, she realized, wouldn't come easily. As the conversation dwindled, Richard shifted his weight, his usual confidence creeping back into his posture. "So, what's next for you?" he asked. "You've got the attention of some big names now. Doors are opening." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. What was next? The thought had been gnawing at her since the gala began. The opportunity to return to the fashion world was within her grasp, but the idea filled her with both excitement and trepidation. "I'm not sure," she admitted. Part of me wants to dive back in, to build something from the ground up. But another part of me is scared. I've been here before, and I know how quickly it can all fall apart. Richard nodded, his expression understanding. It's a risk, he said. But from what I've seen, you're not the type to shy away from a challenge. Clara smiled faintly. I guess not. As the night wore on, their conversation shifted, the tension between them giving way to something more akin to understanding. Richard shared glimpses of his own struggles, moments of failure he rarely spoke of, and Clara found herself softening toward him, though she remained guarded. By the time they parted ways, the city was quiet, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Clara watched as Richard disappeared into the crowd, his figure blending into the bustling life of the city. She turned and began walking in the opposite direction, her thoughts a mix of hope and uncertainty. The night had marked a turning point, not just for her career but for her sense of self. For the first time in years, Clara felt a spark of possibility, a reminder that she was more than her circumstances. The journey ahead would be daunting, but she was ready to face it, one stitch at a time. The days following the gala were unlike anything Clara had experienced in years. Her phone, once silent for days on end, now buzzed constantly with calls and messages. Offers from boutiques, invitations to collaborate, and praise from critics poured in, each one a testament to the power of the dress she had created. Yet, despite the whirlwind of attention, Clara remained grounded, her thoughts often returning to the quiet moments she had spent stitching her vision into reality. She stood at the edge of her new workspace, a small, sunlit room in a community art center, offered to her by Eleanor Baines as part of an initiative to support emerging artists. The space was modest but functional, with a sturdy work table, a sewing machine, and shelves waiting to be filled with bolts of fabric. It was a beginning, and for Clara, beginnings held more promise than endings ever could. As she unpacked her supplies, there was a knock at the door. Clara turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, a leather folder tucked under his arm. He looked different, more casual, less composed, as though he had shed some of the armor he wore so effortlessly at the gala. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Clara hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." Richard stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the room. "This is nice," he said, his tone neutral. "A big step up from, well, you know." Clara crossed her arms, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You can say it. The shelter." He chuckled softly, nodding. "The shelter. But it suits you. It's got potential." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "What brings you here, Richard?" "I thought you'd be busy with your next experiment." His smirk faltered, replaced by a faintly sheepish expression. "I deserve that," he admitted. "But no, this isn't an experiment. I came because—" He paused, his fingers tightening around the folder. "There's something I want you to see." He handed her the folder, and Clara opened it cautiously. Inside were pages of designs, sketches and renderings of projects she hadn't touched in years. She recognized them immediately. They were pieces she had created before the fire, before everything fell apart. "Where did you get these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "After the gala, I did some digging. I wanted to understand your story. I found out about the fire, the insurance mess, everything. And then I found these. They were in the archives of a gallery that used to work with you." Clara's fingers brushed over the pages, her heart aching at the sight of her former work. The designs were both a reminder of what she had lost and a testament to what she had once been capable of. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Why did you bring these to me?" she asked. "Because they're yours," Richard said simply. "And because I think they deserve to see the light of day again." Clara stared at him, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motive. But all she saw was sincerity, a vulnerability that she hadn't thought him capable of. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the gesture settling over them. Finally, Clara closed the folder and set it aside. "Thank you," she said quietly. Richard nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're welcome." As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to rebuild. Not just her career but her sense of purpose. The designs Richard had returned to her became the foundation for a new collection, one that blended her past and present into something wholly unique. With Eleanor's guidance and Richard's unexpected support, she secured a showcase at a prestigious Fashion Week event, marking her return to the industry she had once thought lost to her. The night of the showcase arrived with a mix of anticipation and nerves. Clara stood backstage, watching as models donned her creations and prepared to step onto the runway. The collection was a celebration of resilience, each piece telling a story of transformation and hope. Richard arrived just before the show began, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. He offered her a nod, his expression unreadable. "Ready for the big moment?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "As ready as I'll ever be." The lights dimmed, and the music began. One by one, the models stepped onto the runway, the audience erupting into applause. Clara watched from the wings, her heart swelling with pride. The designs were more than just garments. They were pieces of her soul, stitched together with courage and determination. When the final model stepped onto the runway, wearing the emerald green dress that had started it all, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was deafening, a standing ovation that left Clara breathless. She stepped out onto the runway, her hands trembling as she acknowledged the crowd. As she stood there, soaking in the moment, she caught sight of Richard in the audience. His expression was softer than she had ever seen it, his usual smirk replaced by something closer to admiration. Their eyes met, and in that unspoken moment, Clara felt a sense of closure, not just with him, but with herself. The night ended with a flurry of congratulations and offers, but for Clara, the true victory was internal. She had faced the world that had once broken her and emerged stronger, her scars a testament to her journey. As she walked away from the venue, the city lights shimmering around her, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. Richard walked beside her, his hands in his pockets. "So, what's next?" he asked. Clara smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Whatever comes," she said. "I'm ready for it." And for the first time in years, she truly believed it.